Just, firstly, I have to thank Thomas Wallace O'Donnell down there, who kind of facilitated the invitation from the Civic Trust. So, thanks, Twad, as I know him, but Thomas Wallace O'Donnell. I'm just going to talk about a few things, provide a little bit of context, share just some views I have that I think are in some way sparked, I think, by the budget. I'm very intrigued by providing what appears to be something called uncapped mortgage interest deductibility or relief, something that not even Donald Trump dared make uncapped in the United States. It's quite an extraordinary act of any Western country to do, I think, but it's quite fascinating. It's obviously based on a belief system that obviously the Minister for Finance believes very strongly in, and I think that belief system is largely related to the market. It's a phrase constantly referenced by the current government, and the market in some way can fix some of the challenges that the current government are facing. So that's a kind of tiny hint of what informs what I'd love to talk about. I got to know Thomas from about 15 or 16. We were in school together. And at the time I was deeply interested in reading stuff by British kind of writers like Bertrand Russell or John Stuart Mill or Adam Smith or David Ricardo, all sorts of interesting economists. And when I went to university, I decided to study economics. And I always remember in my very first lecture in Trinity, the lecturer describing the monumental role that Adam Smith had played as the founder really of modern economics, and he produced a masterpiece, the words of the kind of professor, called The Wealth of Nations, and then went on to describe what Adam Smith believed in. To me it felt quite alarming. It was a complete misappropriation or misrepresentation of almost everything that Smith actually believed in, and didn't in any way reflect what Smith had actually written. And I found that hugely alarming, that maybe one of the most respected academic economists in the country could so misrepresent somebody like Adam Smith. But when I looked at the very first chapter of the kind of Introduction to Economics as a textbook by N. Gregory Mankiw, again, the same things were said about Adam Smith, that the invisible hand and the free market were supposed to mean certain things. And certainly those things are applied today. But unfortunately, Adam Smith, when he used the word free market, he didn't mean at all how it is interpreted today. And how Adam Smith wrote about the free market has direct relevance to, I think, the housing crisis that we're facing today. To put it in context, Adam Smith was very deeply influenced by the physiocrats. In the 1750s in France, a small group emerged around their leader, Francois Quesnay, and they called themselves the Economistes. They were the first economists. They were known as the physiocrats, and they were the first to produce what might be called GDP statistics, or national income and product accounts. That was called the tableau économique. They were trying to calculate where surplus was created within the French economy at the time, and therefore where taxes should fall in order to fund the efficient running of the state. They developed a phrase called laissez-nous-faire, laissez-nous-passer, and that ultimately is where the term laissez-faire capitalism comes from. At the time in France, there were certain classes of people that were exempt entirely from taxation. And they were landlords, large property owners, and the clergy. The burden of taxation fell on merchants and manufacturers and labourers. The laissez-nous-passer part, which just means let us pass, was basically referred back to the fact that at the time in France there was still a practice of corvée labour, which meant that ordinary labourers had to give up a portion of their time every year to work on public projects, building roads, building bridges, for example. However, the usage of those bridges and highways, effectively, was heavily taxed. There were tolls on them, and there was no free passage essentially permitted between what might be called even provinces. So the physiocrats came along. They were the first to try and study how the economy worked. And they identified the primary extractors of wealth. They believed very strongly that the only group that really created wealth were merchants, the business or industrious class, and workers. And that the surplus was accruing unfairly to landlords. And as a consequence, landlords needed to be taxed out of existence because they were sterile, they were useless, and they didn't in themselves create any wealth. Instead, they could charge ever greater wealth whilst essentially in their sleep or whilst attending kind of parties in Paris, which became a big bugbear of the physiocrats was absentee landlords, these very wealthy individuals who owned property outside of Paris and did nothing, contributed in no meaningful way to wealth creation. So the laissez-faire, what laissez-faire originally meant was let us be, which was let us be free of the overwhelming burden of taxation within this fledgling economy at the time, which was France. The French at the time were looking to England, which was really beginning to take off, and they were trying to figure out what they needed to do I guess, begin to replicate the success of Britain at the time. So laissez-faire capitalism, as a term, actually means shift the burden of taxation overwhelmingly away from those who work and those who create value, business people, merchants, and you need to tax those that own property heavily. That was referred to by the physiocrats as l'impôt unique, which just basically means a kind of unique tax. You fast forward to Adam Smith, who spent some time in France, and he identifies three of the most important creations, writing, money, and the tableau économique, that was the best method at the time of isolating the unnatural or unfair gains of a class of people who owned property. And he thought and wrote in Book 5 very clearly that not only should there be a unique tax on property owners, but they should bear a huge burden of taxation because ultimately they didn't create any wealth. Instead, they were idle and useless, and as a consequence, should be afforded no privileges. In fact, the opposite. They should be discriminated against, and the cost of rent or the cost of buying land should be driven towards zero. Smith also believed very strongly in public infrastructure, education, building standards, thought spirits should be taxed more than beer for his own reasons, and many other what might be considered market interventions. His interpretation of the word free market was a market free of unfair exemptions or subsidies for the wealthy who own nothing but property but contribute in no way towards actual wealth creation. They're not industrious. That's for him what free market meant, a market free of these charges. You can move to Ricardo. Ricardo was deeply influential following Smith, and he echoed exactly Smith's views. He felt that the interests, writing in a book, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, that the interests of the landlord are always opposed to that of the consumer and the merchant. And he believed also that those that hold land should be granted no privilege, no exemptions from taxation, and their income and wealth should be taxed at a much higher rate than those who earn their income from work or other forms of industry as merchants and manufacturers. Those views run all the way through to John Maynard Keynes, who also felt, he hoped, it's probably the most interesting chapter 24 of Keynes's general theory. He hoped that eventually there would be a kind of slow euthanasia of the rentier class. Those were effectively landlords who owned property and who accrued a yield that was no part their doing. He called it their unearned increment. So as the economy tended to do better, through no act of a landlord could raise the rent on a building that they owned, and that in no way actually contributed. In fact, it hurt the interests of the overall economy. Similar to Ricardo, Keynes felt that those earning wealth or accruing more wealth through the ownership of property was ultimately injurious to economic well-being. It was effectively a zero-sum game, unlike trade, where a buyer and seller tended to benefit, but in the case of landlords, they should effectively be punished and taxed largely out of existence. There was a significant change that happened after World War II. In the United States, at the end of World War II, in 1946, there was probably the most significant moments of upheaval, almost in the history of the United States. And out of that, there was a huge effort by, you might just call it kind of elite property-owning interests, to fund huge re-education campaigns to reorientate the American people to a better set of ideas that would move very firmly away from 200 years of basic Enlightenment thinking and would effectively begin to slowly misappropriate the ideas of classical liberalism, which I'm really just talking about. The ideas I'm talking about are the ideas of classical liberalism. That's really what classical liberalism was. It was a 200-year struggle to separate two forms of income. One form of income is earned through work and creative action, and the other is unearned by those who enjoy a free lunch simply by watching the value of the property that they may hold rise. This is very deeply reflected. I'm just going to go back for a moment. During the 19th century, which is probably the most critical moment of development in the United States, the principles of what we consider today the free market weren't in any way followed. At least there's no evidence that suggests the free market played much, if any, role in the development of the US kind of economic machine. Instead, the ideas that were followed were initially those of Hamilton. He published a very important paper on the subvention of infant industries in 1793. Much later, an economist emerged who became the chief economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln, called Henry Charles Carey, who was the son of Matthew Carey, a very famous Irish revolutionary who moved to Philadelphia and became a publisher in the United States, and also a notable economist. But Henry Carey, an Irish American, became the foremost economist that shaped ultimately the American economic engine, all the way through to perhaps as late as the 1960s. His ideas were more or less, with a few exceptions, quite rigorously followed, and they involved, of course, the taxing of all forms of income at the same rate. In the United States, what's happened certainly over the last 3 or 4 decades is an abandonment of the taxation of all forms of income, and sometimes supernormal taxation on certain forms of income. So now you have a situation where the greatest burden of taxation, or at least the greater burden, is increasingly borne by people who create things and work on things, and those that own property and other forms of assets have largely been untaxed. And that's an idea that is deeply opposed to classical liberalism and is at complete odds with the Enlightenment. After all, the Enlightenment was just a movement against feudalism. Feudalism, the etymology of the word feud and dal, is a fee on an asset. And that is that certain class of people in a society have extra normal rights to charge fees on the assets that they hold. That might be cattle, that might be property, that might be access rights to roads and highways. And the Enlightenment, classical liberalism, being probably the most potent set of ideas, fought very hard against feudal privilege. The types of feudal privilege that existed in France, where a certain class of people, large landowners, were exempt from any taxes whatsoever. Luxury industries were subvented. An example might be if I wish to purchase a bike on the Bike to Work scheme in Ireland today, I will pay in absolute terms a similar amount of tax as if I wanted to avail of Pascal Donoghue's private jet to work scheme, where somehow I'd actually pay less tax on my private jet than I would pay on my bicycle, which is an unusual situation. And it would not be unusual in France 300 years ago, where luxuries were largely untaxed, and those that were focused on the manufacture of luxuries for the elite were subvented, and then the elite who owned all the land could live largely tax-free, and everybody else kind of had to pick up the tab. That kind of provides, I hope, just some context for what I see today, not just in Ireland, but in some other countries, which is a huge misappropriation of the ideas of classical liberalism. If you read Milton Friedman's Free to Choose that he wrote with his wife Rose, it was probably his best-selling book of all, the first paragraph opens with nothing but praise for the father of economics, Adam Smith, and his masterpiece, The Wealth of Nations. Kenneth Arrow, who before Manku wrote the most important economics textbook in the world, also believed that the ideas of neoliberals were built on the granite foundations of classical liberalism, but couldn't be anything further from the truth. The views of neoliberals are entirely opposed to those of classical liberalism. Neoliberals are not particularly liberal, and there's certainly nothing new about their ideas. Their ideas were practiced openly and for many, many centuries in feudal Europe, and they involved constant reductions in the level of taxation on people like me, and the shifting of the overwhelming burden of taxation onto most working people and business people. Another example of this is actually if you go back to the creation of Magna Carta. The year prior to that, you had something called the Revolt of the Barons against King John Lackland. And that was driven simply by the fact that the king had an idea that the elite in his society were going to bear the burden of taxation. They would go and pay their dues, and he would use that to try and run this kind of nascent country as efficiently as he could. When the barons rebelled, they thought this was a terrible idea, and instead the poor people of England at the time should bear the burden of taxation. That's really what kind of feudalism was all about, and I think neoliberalism and many of the ideas that rest at its core are deeply influenced by the ideas that kind of dominated Europe for a long and dark period. And I worry in Ireland that the interpretation of the market and the word free is deeply ignorant of what it actually originally meant. And it's a great shame to see very bright, capable young politicians so deluded by a set of ideas that were promulgated by think tanks and vested, just certain financial interests in the United States that were really never meant to be applied in the developed world. Many of these ideas were initially developed in the 1970s to be exported as relatively effective policies to asset strip third world nations. And that happened to great effect. And there just seems to have been a boomerang effect where these ideas have kind of ricocheted back from the developing world and have found themselves embedded to a point in Ireland. The idea for me that as a domestic landlord in Ireland, you do pay tax, quite a you could argue quite a high rate of tax, but there's another type of landlord, a kind of super duper landlord, a kind of new prince known as a hedge fund or a foreign investor, foreign speculator, who can avail of tax structures that have been created by Fine Gael, such as the LQIV, that was introduced in the last 3 or 4 months as a replacement to the ICAV, which in itself was used because the S110 was shut down. So you may remember in 2016, because of the work of the Sunday Business Post, European Commission, and Stephen Donnelly, at the time, still a TD from Wicklow, it turned out that a lot of the large property funds that had entered Ireland had set up charities, charitable structures, maybe more technically known as orphaned charities, and they were routing all of their revenues in Ireland through these charities and out of the country, and paying a maximum capped tax on all of those revenues of €2,500. Most actually used accountants that managed to get that fee of 2,500 on about 20 billion lower. And that was quite extraordinary. It was a rate of tax far less than, say, Apple, for example. And it was, to a point, shut down in the Finance Bill of 2016. All of these international funds then moved most of their assets into what are called ICAVs. It's another tax structure. But more recently, I presume, under pressure, I don't think that any Fine Gael minister would just wake up in the morning and decide to create an LQIV and to allow it. But for whatever reason, about 4 months ago, LQIVs were introduced. So now all of these foreign speculators are moving their assets into a new tax structure that is protected. One of the issues with the S110 is all revenues were not protected, as in they were ultimately these funds like Cerebus or others had to file with the revenue commissioners. And it was that paper trail that exposed the fact that these new landlords, called them absentee landlords, were paying a supernormally low rate of tax. So I'm guessing that they went for maybe some dinners, possibly with some ministers, that seems to be in vogue at the moment, and compelled them to introduce a tax structure that would enable foreign hedge funds and vulture funds to avail of the Central Bank Secrecy Act, which is, I think, unusual. I don't think any Irish citizen or any Irish business person is allowed to avail of the Central Bank Secrecy Act. So this means that it is, I would believe, in total breach of our obligations under BEPS, which is base erosion and profit sharing. But really, maybe for the first time in history, there will be no paper trail as to how much money these hedge funds extract from this country, how large their rent rolls are. There will be nothing. And for whatever reason, somebody in Leinster House must have thought this was a good idea because it has been implemented, and these things don't just happen by accident. So some of these ideas, you know, the rhetoric that I hear around them is that they have to do with the free market. But, you know, in my eyes, I don't think they have anything to do with the free market whatsoever. I think they hark back to a very dark period in Europe where a certain group of people were allowed to live in great privilege and great comfort, and most other people toiled hard and didn't get much reward for their work or for their creativity. I worry that I just worry these ideas have infested the minds of a lot of our politicians who think that the solution to a housing problem in this country is to introduce tax breaks, mortgage interest deductibility with no cap yet has been mooted. I think that's just an extraordinary act. Not even Donald Trump, in his giveaway to the 1% in the United States, dared do something as crazy as that. And it's quite an achievement to introduce structures like the LQIV. It's quite an achievement to introduce uncapped mortgage interest relief or deductibility. I just have a deep concern. I'll just say kind of a few other things. So that's just a little bit of context for some of my views on classical liberalism, what it means to believe in the free market and what it means to be capitalist. If you Google Henry Charles Carey, who was the most influential economist in Germany as well, he was part of a school. So if you just look at I'm sure if you look at the Wikipedia profile of Henry Carey, you'll see that he was part and the leader of a school, the foremost economist, there were a number of others, of a school called the American School of Capitalism. And for all of these economists, the word capitalism equates to the views that I've shared of Adam Smith, of the physiocrats, of Ricardo, of John Stuart Mill, and much later of Keynes. They never believed for one moment that you should untax or reduce the level of taxation on those that hold property, most particularly those that hold property for the purposes of not living in those properties. They thought that was ruinous and dangerous and had nothing to do with the free market, was deeply opposed to it, and had nothing to do with capitalism. And if you wanted capitalism to flourish in a country, you had to avoid those types of policies because they harked back to a very dark time. I just want to say one other thing, which has to do with the Irish kind of economic model. Adam Smith, what's fascinating about Adam Smith, and I always remember that first lecture in Trinity where the lecturer, this very, very notable economist, was telling us what Adam Smith believed in. I went to the front of the class And I kind of, asked this economist, did Adam Smith ever write anything about the Irish? The answer was no, not that they could recall. And if anybody says they're a classical liberal or they believe in the ideas of Adam Smith and they're Irish and they can't tell you what Adam Smith wrote about the Irish, that's just a kind of an immediate indication that they really just have not read Adam Smith. It's impossible to read Wealth of Nations without actually noting the things he said about the Irish. First and foremost, that the most beautiful women and strongest of men in all of the British dominions are said to come from the lower caste of Irish who survive only on a root vegetable. Kind of like something you can't miss if you read Adam Smith. The closing pages of Book 5 of Wealth of Nations focus on the fact that Ireland got to enjoy all the benefits of being within effectively the kind of nascent British Empire, but did not in any way contribute to the crushing debts that England was bearing at the time. So Ireland back in the 1770s was going through a bit of a boom time. Things were going great. We had limited to no debt, and the very opposite was the case in London. And so Smith is essentially making an argument, not just for Ireland, but also for the United States, that the government of the day ought immediately to start getting their hands on some of the surplus being thrown off in Ireland. It was an incredible moment. And what's interesting is that when William Pitt came to power, he really was a committed Smithian. And I think he took those closing pages very, very seriously, and he set about getting his hands on Ireland. And Ireland at the time had its own parliament and in effect maintained sovereignty over matters such as the excise or import tariffs that it charged. And Ireland did something, from my understanding, though I think the history on it is yet to be kind of properly done, but from some of the more primary source documents and debates from Westminster that I've read, in 1795 the largest dock in the history of the world was opened in Dublin, largely because huge amounts of goods were being ferried through Dublin, which is the third busiest port in Europe at the time, if that's believable, were being docked in Ireland, and because we were part of a common trading area, we would dock those goods for a short period of time, about 24 hours, and then we would sell them, or they would be sold tax-free into this common market that we were part of. Ireland became, incredibly affluent. It was a moment when great houses were being built at a rate that wasn't in any way being replicated in England. And so in 1795, William Pitt began to, and I can finish at any moment, William Pitt set about doing, I think, two incredible things that were replicated all across the British Empire. Sectarianism in any of the colonies, or I don't really know to what extent. Ireland, I guess, was a colony, but it was slightly different in terms of the brutality that was meted out to people elsewhere in the British Empire. So in 1795, Pitt set about doing two things. He established the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland. He paid for the construction of the Royal College of St. Patrick at Maynooth. And from 1795 through to when Gladstone took power, the seminary in Maynooth and elsewhere, all the teaching of all of the priests in this country was paid for exclusively using money from the English government. And that had to do with control. In 1795, Pitt also set about funding the establishment of the Orange Order on Dawson Street, and I think it was a quite spectacular and brilliant move. If you fast forward a little bit, I think, we'll skip forward to kind of 5 or 6 years. Obviously, Ireland lost its parliament, and in so doing, it lost its kind of small amount of sovereignty over its ability to set arbitrarily its own tax rates. Fast forward to 40 years ago, and maybe T.K. Whitaker was reading a little bit of history and realised that we're going to be joining a new common market pretty soon, where we would maintain sovereignty over our own tax rates, and we could probably do a similar kind of strategy as we've done in the past, because it had made Ireland incredibly wealthy. By 1830, almost kind of half a generation before the famine, if you look at the research of Madison, who's probably the foremost historical economist when it comes to the calculation of the wealth of nations over time, estimated that Ireland was the 14th wealthiest nation in the world. By 1870, it had risen to the 13th wealthiest nation in the world. And it was around 1870 that Gladstone came to power. He'd resigned really just as the famine was taking off in Ireland, because he was at odds with Robert Peel, who believed very strongly that the grant to Maynooth, known as the Maynooth Grant, should be radically increased, ultimately, I think, to ensure absolute loyalty of the Catholic hierarchy through the famine. Peel won the day. The leader of the opposition was John Russell, who was Bertrand Russell's granddad, and he managed to quadruple the grant to Maynooth. There were many arguments at the time. At the time, Ireland was overrun by priests. There weren't enough parishes anymore to fit the priests. But Peel was very open to helping accelerate the movement of Catholic priests all across the empire, who became our missionaries. The reason, I would argue, I think that Ireland ended up with so many missionaries inside the British Empire was because the English gave us so much money to fund the project of the creation of the Roman Catholic Church. The version of Catholicism that I believe was most favoured by the English was something called Ultramontanism, which really came to the fore by 1850, at which point Maynooth had become the largest seminary in the history of the Catholic world, producing more priests every year than anything that had ever existed anywhere else in the world. Ultramontanism really began to take hold. That's a version of Catholicism that probably finds its bedfellow in Wahhabism within Islam, which is the most, you might say, conservative or extreme version of Islam that believes very strongly in Sharia law and in the unification of the church and the state. And that was really a core part of the English, British created Roman Catholic Church.